Picture this. You're on the Via Sacra, the most important street in the world's most powerful city. It's the summer of 100 AD. The sun is beating down hard at noon. There are 15,000 people around you, including senators, soldiers, merchants, slaves, priests, and prostitutes. Believe it or not, every single one of them smells like pee. Yes, urine. Not even a little. Not at all. Very much. That's correct. All the time. They've been everywhere. From their robes, to their skin, to the soles of their sandals, to the walls of every building they've been in. And the best part is that no one seems to care. Not at all. The smell doesn't mean that someone is poor or doesn't care. It's a sign that the economy is doing well. Urine-powered Rome. Yes, that's right. And it was on a large scale. It was on purpose. On a scale that is impossible to ignore once you know how it works. And the smell, the strong pneumonia smell you got when you went from a Roman street to a fuller's workshop, a tannery, a bathhouse, or a senator's dining room, was civilization doing what it was supposed to do. Let me tell you how it worked. Not just the pee, though we'll get to that point and go into detail. The whole system that Rome built around things that most people today don't want to talk about. No one tells you this about the biggest empire in history. It wasn't clean. It wasn't respectful. It didn't smell like marble or laurel wreaths. The smell of fermentation, sulfur, and the fragility of the work of 2 million people crammed together was strong. That was the start of Western civilization. Let's get started. Let's start with the basics, since the basics are already crazy. Roman fullers, who were in charge of cleaning and processing wool, needed urine. Not sometimes, not as a last resort, all the time in large amounts as their main cleaning agent. At the time, there was no other product that could break down grease, get rid of stains, and soften wool fibers like ammonia did. So they picked it up from the people, no cost. They put big clay pots, called dolia, on street corners all over the city. People would stop, lift their robes, and give. That's what people did. It wasn't weird, it was part of the system. Take a second to look at this picture. You don't see just one jar on the street corner. You can imagine that in a city with 1 to 2 million people, hundreds of jars are being filled, emptied, and refilled over and over again, day and night, by people who have logically decided that collecting and processing other people's urine is a perfectly reasonable way to make a living. And they were correct, because there was a huge need for it. It was necessary to process every tunic, toga, and length of wool that came from a Roman loom. The fuller's trade wasn't a small one. It was a big part of how Romans dressed, and how they dressed was a big part of how they showed their status, rank, and identity. The toga of the senator, washed with pee, the cloak of the army officer, pee, the priest's ceremonial clothes. You already know what to do. Believe it or not, fullers also used pee to make something we would call a primitive bleach today. They put fabrics in big vats of old, strong urine, which smelled bad enough that I won't describe it. The ammonia in the urine bleached the cloth. In Rome, white was a color of status. Rich people wore white. White stood for power. White, dressed like a senator, meant that someone, somewhere, had been collecting and processing a lot of urine for you. So, the more urine you collect, the higher your status. So, this brings us to one of my favorite parts of Roman administrative history. At some point in the 1st century AD, Emperor Vespasian looked at the urine economy, saw that it was making a lot of money, and did what any ruler who cared about money would do. He put a tax on it, a real tax that is enforced and brings in real money for the imperial treasury. Titus, his son, who seemed to have some sense of propriety, disagreed. He thought it was not dignified. He told his dad this. Vespasian's answer has lasted for 2,000 years, which shows how much the Romans liked a good comeback. He held a coin up to his son's face and said something like, "Does this smell?" "It doesn't smell. There is no smell." Meaning, cash is cash. It doesn't matter where it came from. A denarius from taxing the collection of urine is worth the same as one from taxing the importation of grain. The treasury doesn't care where it came from. Titus didn't know what to say. And now, 2,000 years later, the word for a public urinal in Italian and a few other Romance languages, Vespasianum, still has his father's name, because Vespasian taxed pee, and people still remember that in the language long after his engineers built every aqueduct. If I had been Titus at that moment, I hope I would have said something smart. But the argument about the coin is pretty strong. The man was right. This is where things get more interesting. Because the urine economy wasn't just about washing clothes. It was so deeply ingrained in Roman life that most people, even those who know the basics, don't fully understand it. Tanners used it to make leather last longer. Dyers used it to set color. Doctors prescribed it for skin problems and treating wounds. Before you freak out, this isn't completely crazy, because diluted ammonia does have some antiseptic properties. Dentists said it was good for making teeth whiter. This was written about by real, published, and widely read Roman poets. It was brought up by Catullus. Pliny the Elder wrote about it in his Natural History, sounding like a man writing down a medical fact that wasn't up for debate. It wasn't just poor people who whitened their teeth. Literary sources link it to the Iberians, which is a general term for the people who live in Spain. Roman writings said that the Iberians had very white teeth and didn't care much about how they got them. So, urine was used as an industrial solvent, a bleaching agent, a tanning chemical, a dye fixative, a medical treatment, and a dental hygiene product by the most powerful empire in human history. It got this urine from the public by putting jars on street corners and taxing the transactions. It also named a type of coin after the smell argument that justified the tax. Eventually, the whole system became so ingrained in the language that native speakers today say the word without knowing what it originally meant. That's a lot of civilization to build on top of a bodily function. And this is only the beginning. If you think urine was the weirdest thing Romans used for work, just wait until you hear what happened at the other end of the digestive process. The Roman latrina wasn't a bathroom. It wasn't a private area. It wasn't a place where you could be alone with your thoughts. It was a space. Sometimes a big room. There are stone benches along the walls, and each one has a series of keyhole-shaped holes cut into it at regular intervals. No separators. There are no curtains. There are no walls between one opening and the next. You sat down so that the person on your left and the person on your right could reach you, and you talked to them in the same way you would at a dinner party. The Romans didn't see going to the bathroom as a private thing. They saw it as a chance. What for? Mostly talking. Rumors, news about politics, business, and society. Ancient sources say that the latrine was one of the few places in Roman daily life where strict social hierarchy was temporarily put on hold. The graffiti evidence from Herculaneum supports this idea to some extent. A senator and a freedman could sit on the same bench, an officer in the legion and a regular soldier, a rich business owner and one of his workers. Because everyone was doing the same thing, the physical equality of the situation made it easier for people to talk to each other than in more formal settings. There was also a stick with a sponge on it. I need to think about this for a minute because it matters and because it has to do with the next video, which you should definitely watch. Roman people didn't write on paper. They used a natural sea sponge with a wooden or bone handle. They rinsed it in a channel of running water that ran along the floor in front of the bench. Used it, rinsed it again, and put it back in a shared holder for the next person. Shared. One sponge. For all. Romans didn't think this was dirty. This was part of the infrastructure. The sponge had a name, the xylospongium, or just the spongia. In Roman writing, it is talked about in the same way we would talk about a hand towel. We're going to put off answering the question of what it really did to the intestinal health of regular users until the next video in this series, which we'll get to at the end. I'll warn you now that the answer isn't comfortable and will change how you think about Roman life expectancy. Back to the bathroom. The social dynamics get more interesting when you start to pull on the thread. The foci, which were the bigger public toilets in Rome, cost money. You had to pay to get in. When you think about it, that's pretty amazing. Not because charging for bathroom access is strange. It's still done in some parts of Europe today. But because it suggests a business model. Someone owned the bathroom. Someone took the money. Someone was in charge of the cleaning staff, the upkeep of the sponges, and the flow of water. What about the trash? That was useful. The Cloaca Maxima was a huge sewer system in Rome. It started out as an open drainage channel in the 6th century BC and was slowly closed off and expanded until it became one of the most advanced waste management systems in the ancient world. But the Cloaca Maxima didn't go to most private homes. It didn't connect to most of the apartment buildings, called insulae, where most of the people in Rome lived. So what happened to the trash from those buildings? Some of them went into cesspools under the building. Some of it was picked up by waste haulers, who were professional teams that would empty cesspits at night and take the contents outside the city walls, where farmers would buy it as fertilizer. In a world without synthetic nitrogen, manure was a very useful agricultural input. Some of it, though the sources are careful, was just thrown out of windows on the upper floors and onto the street below, as the archaeological evidence shows. This was technically against Roman law. There were laws, there were punishments, but enforcement was hit or miss, and the insulae of the Subura, Rome's most crowded and chaotic neighborhood, were not known for their residents' strict adherence to city sanitation codes. At the very least, you needed to know how high up you were when you walked through some parts of Rome at night. Roman sources say to walk close to buildings instead of down the middle of the street, for a reason. Things landed in the middle. Now, the part that most people still miss. All of this work, picking up trash, hauling away cesspits, cleaning the streets and fixing the sewers, provided jobs for a large number of people in Rome. Not a glamorous job, not a job that anyone would brag about at a dinner party, but work that is real, paid, and makes a difference in the economy. And the people at the top of this system, like the contractors who had the contracts for handling municipal waste, organized the teams, owned the carts, and negotiated the sales of fertilizer. Some of them got rich. Not as rich as a senator, but wealthy enough to buy a house in a good neighborhood, have a good job, and send their kids to school. In a very real way, Rome's economy was built on things that people could no longer use, and it made some of those people wealthy. This shows you how Romans thought about what was valuable. Nothing was wasted because there was no way to waste anything. There were resources for every byproduct of 2 million people living in one place. Owners had incentives, and incentives made systems. Systems that smelled awful, but worked very well. But now I want to talk about the one part of Roman daily hygiene that most people think they know, and that almost everyone gets wrong. The baths in Rome. The thermae. You know about these. You might have a vague idea that they stand for something good, like a commitment to public health, or a democratic institution where rich and poor people washed themselves in the same water. I'm going to let that thought sit for about 30 seconds, because I think it's important that you have it clearly in your mind before I break it down. The thermae were really cool. The baths of Caracalla, which were finished in 217, could hold 1,600 people at once. There are hot rooms, warm rooms, cold plunge pools, exercise yards, libraries, gardens, and shops. High-cost systems heated the rooms. These systems used channels under the floor tiles to move hot air around. By almost any standard, it was an amazing feat of engineering. From a microbiological point of view, they were also a disaster. In some ways, the Romans understood cleanliness the same way we do, but in other ways, they were very different. They knew that washing got rid of dirt that was easy to see. They didn't know about germ theory because it wouldn't be around for another 17 centuries. They didn't know that warm, crowded, shared water is one of the best places for bacteria and parasites to spread by accident. The pools weren't emptied and filled again between bathers. On a busy day at a big facility, the water that the first person to bathe in the morning came in with was the same water that the last person to bathe in the evening came out with. There are 1,600 people, a single body of warm water, not filtering. Over the past 30 years, as environmental archaeology has become more advanced, archaeologists have found evidence of what lived in Roman bathhouses. This evidence comes from drain sediment and includes whipworm, roundworm, entamoeba, trichuries, and several other organisms whose names are less important than their general category. Things that will make your stomach feel a lot worse than it did before you got in the water. One study published in Parasitology found that the number of intestinal parasites in Roman period Britain was the same as or higher than that of the population before the Roman Iron Age. Even though the Romans had much better sanitation systems, the infrastructure was already in place. They didn't know how to use it to actually lower the risk of infection. People went to the bathhouse. They went, they felt fresh. They had more passengers than when they got there. Now, this is the funny part. The Romans did use a cleaning tool that works very well by today's standards. The strigil. You would use a curved bronze or iron scraper to lift dirt, dead skin cells, sweat, and the olive oil you put on before working out. You scraped. Everything that was in the oil came off. You were actually pretty clean when it came to getting rid of bacteria and dead skin on your skin. The funny thing is that the strigil was used in the same place as the community pool. You scraped off the stuff on your skin and then sat in water that was aggressively adding new things. It's not clear if a Roman bath made you better or worse off in terms of microbes. Some historians say it's good overall. Some people say it's about the same. The parasitology data suggests a net detrimental effect, particularly for specific types of infections. Then there's the oil. Rich Romans had slaves who would oil and scrape them, but they did collect the scrapings, which were a grayish mix of olive oil, sweat, dead skin, and other things, because they were worth something. Sold as a drug, for skin care, as an ingredient in some recipes. People really wanted the scrapings from the strigils of famous athletes. For example, a wrestler's scrapings would be collected, bottled, and sold for a lot of money, because people thought that the physical excellence had somehow been transferred into the material that was taken out of his body. I want to be careful about how I say this, because it's easy to make fun of and a little harder to understand. The Romans were smart. They were working within a system that was consistent with itself and led to correct conclusions in many areas. They were wrong about germ theory, but so was everyone else for the next 1700 years. In certain aspects, such as the strigil and the focus on oiling prior to exercise, they adopted practices that are, from a dermatological standpoint, not unwarranted. The difference between what Romans thought about hygiene and what was really going on with their bodies is huge and worth thinking about, because it shows you how civilization works. Even if you build the most advanced public health system in the ancient world, you could still be wrong about how diseases work. And the infrastructure, like the aqueducts, sewers, baths, and latrines, will still be good for people, even if it also hurts people in ways you can't see yet. Rome's public health was better than what came after it. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the lack of infrastructure made disease environments that were much worse by almost any measure. The baths could have been places where germs spread. In 6th century Europe, they were still better than not bathing at all. A strange kind of win. But there were a lot of them in Rome. I need to tell you about the perfume business, which is another strange success. To fully understand why Romans smelled the way they did, you need to know how they tried to smell like something else. And the ways they did it are, in at least one case, really surprising. What did a rich Roman really smell like? This question seems easy but isn't. Not what they wanted to smell like, not what their scent maker told them. What did they really smell like after a day of normal Roman life, standing in a room? There are at least 4 layers to the answer, and none of them are very appealing. The first layer is smoke. There were lots of open fires in Rome. There were cooking fires, braziers for heat, oil lamps burning in every room, and wealthy homes and public baths had flame-heated hypocaust systems. There was a lot of smoke and particles in the air. Everyone took it in all the time. The street is the second layer. Roman streets were not paved in a way that made them clean. They were made of stone and collected everything that fell on them, as well as everything that was thrown from windows, walked through, dragged across, and left behind by the animals, horses, mules, oxen, and goats that lived in the same area as the people. Walking through Rome meant walking through a layer of organic material that was always getting thicker. Your sandals touched it. The hem of your clothing touched it. At the end of the day in Rome, the bottom of your clothes had been in a lot of contact with the street. The fullers are the third layer. If your clothes had just been washed, which by Roman standards meant in the last few weeks, they had been washed with urine, the smell of ammonia went away a lot when it dried. But old sources say it never went away completely. And in Rome's hot summers, when wool was the main fabric, the temperature outside would bring back smells that had been dormant for a while. The body itself is layer 4. Romans took more baths than most people did before the modern era, but they sweated between baths, in a city where most homes didn't have indoor plumbing, in a climate that really got hot, and in a culture that valued physical activity. And sweating in wool in a city where the base-level ambient smell was already several layers of interesting, made a smell that we would recognize as human, even if it wasn't pleasant. The Roman perfume industry worked very hard in spite of all of this. Roman perfumers, or unguentarii, made a huge variety of things. Rose oil is made by pressing and infusing petals. Spikenard, which comes from the Himalayas and costs a lot to bring in. Balsam from Judea was so valuable that the Romans fought a whole war to get it. Myrrh, frankincense, oil of cinnamon, iris, narcissus. The most expensive perfumes cost more than most people make in a year. Pliny the Elder went on and on about this, just like people with a certain personality type have complained about luxury goods throughout history. He thought it was morally wrong that Roman citizens would spend a lot of money on something that, in his words, only benefited the nose and was gone by the end of the day. He wasn't completely wrong about the money. He was kind of missing the point of the function. In Rome, perfume wasn't just for looks. It was a way to talk to each other. It told you, before you could talk to it, that you had the money to buy something expensive and the social standing to use it in public. It covered up smells that couldn't be avoided in a city where no one, no matter how rich, could avoid them. It was used in religious, political, and death-related settings. For example, important Romans' bodies were heavily scented before they were cremated, and the cost of the perfume was a sign of how important the person was. But here's something that most people don't know. Some of the things that Romans put on their skin to smell good were made from biological waste. Musk, from civets. Beavers make castoreum. Ambergris is a waxy substance that sperm whales make in their stomachs and then throw up into the ocean. It floats there until someone finds it and sells it to a perfumer for a lot of money. Real Roman perfumes had real ingredients that plant-based scents didn't have, like depth, longevity, and the ability to fix lighter scents and make them last. So, the rich Roman who walked by you smelling like expensive rose oil and balsam also smelled like olive oil, street dirt, the ammonia ghost of their cleaned toga, and something that came from the intestines of a marine mammal. And that mix layered, complicated, not always pleasant, but very human, was the smell of success to the people around them. Based on all of this, it would be easy to think that Romans didn't mind smells as much as we do. They had lower limits, different ways of thinking, or just put up with things that we would find unacceptable. But I don't think that's true. The evidence shows that Romans were very sensitive to smells, especially those that went against social norms. There is a whole genre of Roman literature that makes fun of people who smell bad. Martial and Catullus both had a lot to say about how people they didn't like smelled. People knew that having bad breath was a social problem. It was okay for a lower-class person to smell like garlic, but it was a bad sign for someone who should have known better. The rules of society were set up in a different way, not lower, not the same. In a city where everyone, from the emperor to the slaves, had to deal with the same basic problems of urban density and pre-modern sanitation, there was a common understanding that some smells were unavoidable, some were managed, and some were changed into something that at least partly worked through cleverness and the Roman ability to turn a problem into a system. So, now I want to tell you the last thing I want to say. The thing that changed the way I think about Roman civilization completely once I understood it. The smell of Rome was because of a choice. One person made one choice on one day, a collective generational and civilizational choice to regard every byproduct of urban existence, every waste stream, every odor, and every discarded material from other cultures, as a resource to be harnessed, organized, and utilized. The urine in the jars on the street corner didn't mean that sanitation had failed. It was a chain of supplies. The fees for the latrines weren't an insult. They were a way to make money. The strigil scraps weren't trash. They were something that was made. The smells of ammonia from the fullers, sulfur from the tanners, and animal waste from the street markets were all over the place. But they didn't mean that Rome was dirty. They were signs that Rome was busy. Now, you have been patient. I promised you a sponge, and I gave you one. I also promised you that the sponge would have effects, and I kept that promise by talking about it, but not explaining it. That was on purpose, because what the shared sponge did to Roman intestines is a story that deserves its own time, its own evidence, and, I warn you, a level of detail that will change your perspective on the history of Roman medicine that you were never taught in school. Next comes that story